Today we're going to discuss conflict. Conflict is very important because without conflict, there is no story. There are several stages of conflict, and most stories usually follow the same pattern. So first, an author usually gives exposition. Exposition sets up the story for the reader. This is where the author will establish characters, setting, and plot. The rising action is where the conflict is introduced. It's the reader's first hint that there might be a problem. The rising action includes the conflict escalating until it reaches climax. The climax is where the conflict peaks at its highest point. Following the climax, there's the falling action in which the conflict begins to unwind, and finally, there's the resolution. The problem will work itself out one way or the other. So whether it's a happy ending or a tragic ending, the problem will have some sort of resolution. There are several different types of conflict that we're going to explore, and the first type of conflict is man versus man. This type of conflict is external, and quite simply, it's between two characters. When one character's wants, motives, or actions run contrary to another's, it's a man versus man conflict. Conflict often exists between the protagonist and the antagonist. An example of a man versus man conflict is the Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet. Both the families are feuding against each other. Another example is John Proctor versus Abigail in The Crucible. Abigail's desire to be with John Proctor runs counter to his marriage with Elizabeth. Another very popular example, which is a very simple example to depict man versus man, would be The Tortoise and the Hare. So even though neither of these are men, the two characters are pitted against each other in a race. The next type of conflict is also external, and it's man versus nature. This conflict includes man fighting against an outside force like a natural disaster, an animal, a storm, or the environment. So it usually depicts a character's struggle to survive. The book Hatchet and the movie Castaway are good examples of man versus nature. The conflict exists in both the characters' struggle to survive and get off their respective islands and get back to civilization. Moby Dick also features a man attempting to track down and hunt an elusive whale to get revenge. The next type of conflict is man versus society. This is when a character struggles against social norms, laws, government, or tradition. The character may be fighting for rights or for a specific cause. Sometimes society is depicted as a character itself. Examples of character versus society conflicts include The Hunger Games, 1984, and To Kill a Mockingbird. In The Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen rages against the corrupt capital that imposes inhumane restrictions on its people. The characters in 1984 rebel against the government that's always watching. And the government is actually referred to as Big Brother, which is an ironic name meant to mock the way the government tries to pretend as if their involvement is for the good of the people when it's actually very invasive and harmful. And lastly, To Kill a Mockingbird exposes a corrupt judicial system that favors whites over blacks. So Tom Robinson and Atticus Finch fight against a racist society to try to promote change. The last type of conflict is internal, and it's man versus himself. So oftentimes the conflict is not against an outside force, but within the character. So a character may feel conflicted morally or have an important decision to make. So John Proctor, for instance, is faced with either telling the court about his affair and exposing Abigail as a fraud, but ruining his reputation, or remaining quiet and keeping his good name. So again, in the end of the novel, he has to decide between lying and confessing that he's a witch to save his life and destroying his good name and reputation, or remaining quiet, staying true to himself, and facing death. Othello is also conflicted with jealousy, and Macbeth is in a battle with his conscience. So in our next class, you're going to be asked to identify different types of conflict in Of Mice and Men. So please look at the following example from Chapter 4 and be ready to find other examples from the novel. So Crooks is an example of man versus society. Okay, and we're going to take a look at how. Because he's black, he's segregated from the rest of the men. He doesn't sleep in the bunkhouse with the rest of them. Instead, he lives outside in the stables with the horses. And in this chapter, he has to hide his pleasure at finally being a part of some sort of social gathering after years of solitude. And this is when Lenny comes in to visit him. He's also discriminated against. He's consistently called the N-word. He doesn't even have a name in this story. So he's called Crooks because he has a crooked back, and he's not even given the respect of having a name among the men. And he has this in common with Curly's wife. You might have noticed that she's just referred to as Curly's wife and doesn't have a name either. But for a moment, he feels very hopeful that he can be a part of the men's American dream. He asks them if he could come along and he could be of help on the farm, but he's quickly reminded of his place in society when Curly's wife comes in and berates him. She viciously reminds him that she can accuse him of rape at any moment and have him lynched. So at the end of the chapter, he accepts his position as a lowly stable buck with no friends and no future. So this conflict has an exposition, and we're introduced to Crooks in the beginning of the novella when we learn about him through the other characters. The rising action begins when Lenny enters his room and starts asking him questions about why he's isolated from the rest of the men. The conflict reaches a high point when Crooks asks to be a part of the dream, but Curly's wife abuses him with her words. The falling action shows Crooks submitting to Curly's wife and losing hope of a better life, and the resolution is at the end of the chapter when Crooks is slowly rubbing oil on his crooked spine to relieve his pain, something that he does every night. This shows that nothing is ever going to change. He'll never be able to have the American dream, and society is always going to stay the same. So I'd like for you to take a moment to brainstorm and think about any book that you have ever read and describe the conflict. Okay, so quite simply, think about what the problem is in the story and be sure to include what type of conflict it is and why. All right, so if it's man versus man, explain how, or if it's man versus society, what exactly are they fighting against? Use the Crooks example that I just gave as a model for your own writing, and be ready to find more examples of conflict and of Mice and Men tomorrow in class. And remember, in life, the test comes first and learning the lesson follows.